Welcome, everyone. We're waiting for more people to join. We're just starting the first of our series this week, State of Poland, ahead of a very important vote to happen this Sunday. A key highlight in Polish democracy in the process that we're expecting will be really attended by a lot of journalists, a lot of press in Poland as well. I think both parties, the main opposition party and the government, are advertising these elections as the most important elections of the century for sure so far. And even some claim this is the most important one since 1989. We'll give just one more minute for everyone to join in before we introduce our speakers and welcome you all. So just bear with me. I think this time it's also helpful to adjust your volume, sit back comfortably, prepare your questions. Feel free also to throw them at us at any moment through chat, and especially that's useful in the first part of the meeting, which is on the record, and in the second part of the meeting off the record, when we open Q&A, we will actually be engaging you directly in the conversation. So 3 minutes past 3 Polish Central European time. Welcome all to the State of Poland, State of Polish Politics discussion. My name is Wojciech Przybylski. I'm editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight and president of Respublika Foundation, which is the organization behind Visegrad Insight. And I'm welcoming you all. Thank you all for joining. We're expecting a couple more people later during this hour. Welcome and thank you for subscribing to Visegrad Insight. This part of the series is for subscribers only session for getting a sense of what is Poland all about these days ahead of the critical vote that will take place on the 15th of October this year. And it's part of the series that is repeated every day, same hour, Monday to Thursday this week. Today we're talking about Polish politics. Tomorrow we'll talk with the state of Polish-Ukrainian relations. And later on Wednesday, we will discuss economy. Finally, to dwell on the subject of Polish defense. For all who have declared to subscribe, there is this special code you'll find again in your emails. So using Polish elections will give you a yearly discount for a subscription. And that's all from the main announcements. Perhaps one more on Monday afternoon after elections. We're planning a session just by our editors to host you again. So expect another invitation email in your inbox to discuss the results, the outcomes of the votes. And we assume that we'll know by afternoon what the results may be. So I mentioned already, this is the first part of the discussion in which we're having 30 minutes discussion between our distinguished speakers. And then the Q&A session will be kicked off right after, with the recording turned off. And we have excellent speakers today. Justyna Pawlak, Bureau Chief of Central Europe and Balkans from Thomson Reuters, and Alex Szczerbia, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex. And also joining us to kickstart our Q&A session, Agnieszka Homajska from Visegrad Insight team. Now, there is someone recording. I see Velina recording that. Please, Velina, do make sure that you do not record the second part of the conversation as are by our rules. And now onto the big question. I think it will be quite interesting to give the latest survey, opinion polls, numbers that may indicate for what sort of result are we heading on Sunday. Alex, would you be so kind to take a moment and enlighten us as to, what is the overall trend and maybe more or less the level of support for the parties that are in the game?
Yeah, so I think that Law and Justice is currently averaging around 36% in the polls at the moment. And in order to get in the territory that it needs for an overall majority, obviously, depending what happens to the minor parties, it's going to need about 40%, basically. So at the moment, it's kind of 3-4% short of where it needs to be. So the least likely scenario currently looks like it's going to be another majority Law and Justice government. I mean, that's not impossible. The polls could be getting something wrong. The undecideds, a lot of whom there are a lot, could break for Law and Justice at the last minute. Or critically, one of the opposition parties here, we're talking about Third Way in particular, might not cross the 8% threshold. I think that a possible scenario is the opposition parties having enough seats for a majority. At the moment, most polls show that won't happen, but that's certainly within the realms of possibility. I mean, not a single opinion poll for a very long time has shown Law and Justice getting a majority. So that's at the moment a very unlikely scenario, whereas the opposition is a possible scenario. And I think that at the moment, most opinion polls show that there will be no party will have the Law and Justice, neither the main current opposition parties will have an overall majority. The balance of power will be held by the Confederation. The Federation has lost some support over the summer, but most opinion polls still show it averaging at just under 10%, with which the current configuration means that they would hold the balance of power. So that's the most likely scenario at the moment. Law and Justice, largest party, probably getting about 200 maybe seats. It needs 230 to get a majority, possibly with the opposition getting enough, but more likely Confederation holding the balance of power.
There's one party that runs, actually two parties that run together as a coalition of parties. This is the so-called Third Way. The Third Way consists of the Farmers Party, Peasant Party, PSL, and a new party led by Szymon Hołownia, a former presidential candidate. What are the odds, in your opinion, that they will not make it and the votes will be lost to meet the threshold of 8 percentage points?
I think they're on a knife edge at the moment, quite frankly. I mean, when that formation was formed, they were looking like they were going to get about 15% of the vote. But I think at the moment, I mean, most opinion polls say they will cross that 8% threshold. Okay, but there's all kinds of dynamics that might happen here. I mean, these kind of formations are particularly vulnerable to being squeezed. In particular, in a situation like the current election, where it's a polarizing election. So people may decide to come to the conclusion that the best way, if they want to get rid of Law and Justice, is to vote for the largest grouping, which is Civic Platform. And Civic Platform's actually conscious of this, and they've kind of rode back a little bit in terms of their polarizing narrative. They actually know that it's a great risk for them if the Third Way don't cross the 8% threshold. And I think in an election of uncertainties, which it is, this is probably the most uncertain election that we've had for a long time. This is the biggest uncertainty. I think they are absolutely on a knife edge at the moment, and it could go either way. And that's incredibly significant. I mean, it opens up a potential pathway for Law and Justice to get a majority. Let's not forget, they got a majority with only 38% of the vote, okay, in 2015, because the left didn't cross the 8% threshold at that time. Equally, it makes it very, very difficult for the opposition to get the numbers. I mean, virtually impossible for the opposition to get the numbers to form a majority. Whereas if they do cross the threshold, then that becomes a real possibility. So I think it's a complete toss-up at the moment. I think they're on an absolute knife edge at the moment.
All right, let's cross into the territory in the realm of the right-wing journalism. And I'm not speaking of Reuters here, which is non-partisan, but Justyna, you took a moment this morning to look into what are the narratives in the right-wing government-supportive press and media. So what is it about?
I was actually quite surprised what I saw this morning. For quite some time, ever since opinion polls have been showing that the election is such a knife edge election, as Alex was explaining. So for quite some time since then, the key narrative here was that among a lot of the kind of the political commentators was that if PiS fails to win a majority, and if it fails to as it often happens in Poland, in Polish politics, you kind of try to bring lawmakers from other parties into your own fold by offering all kinds of incentives. So there has been a lot of debate that that PiS will try to do that, just kind of widen their base with whoever is actually elected to parliament. And then the next step has been discussed is that if that doesn't happen, if Konfederacja, the far right party that Alex has mentioned, gets too many votes, and it's just impossible to reel in enough lawmakers, that PiS would seek an early election. And so early elections is an issue that's been discussed as something that we could expect in the spring. That this uncertainty could that if the result is very uncertain, as it very likely will be. The kind of the politics around it will drag out to the spring, and then we'll have another election. So this morning, the right-wing news weeklies that are quite supportive of the government and get a lot of funding from the government, the message is that no, that if PiS doesn't win a majority, and if it doesn't win enough lawmakers from other parties, early elections is extremely unlikely. Because there's other elections in next year. There's a regional election, which is always very important for big parties, because that's where you kind of build your base and your financing, and that's happening in the spring. And then there's the European, the less relevant, but still the European Parliament election. And a lot of the local politicians, including PiS, will not have enough bandwidth to handle that, which to me sounded like a very surprising opening of a door to the possibility that PiS will just say, fine, you have it. If the result is very close between what it gets and what the kind of the mainstream liberal opposition gets. The other question has been what would happen to the far right party? Would it try to build a coalition? Would it agree, even though it has said repeatedly that it would say no? Would it agree to have a coalition with PiS, or maybe even with the kind of the mainstream liberal opposition? And the right-wing news weeklies would say no. That in the end, for Kaczyński, the idea of having a potentially disloyal and a potentially very unreliable coalition partner in the form of the far right is just not. It's just not a real option. That he does not want to rule to govern like that. In which case, it really opens the door to Kaczynski stepping back if it gets too complicated, I think. But let's see.
Okay. Now, I'm actually of the opinion myself that there is a big change coming about, and we can, of course, inspect the possibilities of PIS staying in power, but in a way that would be also boring. Let's entertain a thought of having a Polish new government composed of a number of parties. What would such government look like? What do you expect its primary challenges? It's starting from its formation to the priorities and kind of the focal points, and also maybe some pearls on the way of the next year in government. How would that possibly look like? Alex, would you entertain such a thought?
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing to bear in mind is that that this is going to be quite a diverse, quite heterogeneous government, which will compose parties ranging from social conservatives in the Peasant Party, the PSL, through to people quite radically on the left, in the Razem Party. So it'll be difficult for it to put together a coherent governing platform. It will face a president in Andrzej Duda, who will be hostile to the government, and this will they'll have this as a problem right from the off, because of course the president gets to choose who gives the first opportunity to form the government. But more importantly, even if they do form a government, they will have to get past a presidential veto. I mean, I'm not going to bet on the Polish election, but one thing I would definitely bet on is that they're not going to get the 276 seats that they need to overturn a presidential veto. So legislatively, it will be very, very difficult for them to get stuff through. They will also face, even if they do get the legislation through, a constitutional tribunal, every single one of whose members, I know that 3 of them are contested, has been appointed since Law and Justice was elected, and which could strike down any of their laws. So I think it's going to be difficult for them to get legislation through. I think the biggest change we're likely to see is in terms of personnel, okay, in terms of turnover of elites. So here we're talking about things like public administration, state-owned companies, supervisory bodies, local administration, and the diplomatic corps. I think there'll be so I think that's the ones that will be more difficult will be personnel that are kind of constitutionally protected, or that it requires legislation in order to remove them. So the Constitutional Tribunal, you know, I mean, 3 of those members are contested, but nobody contests the method through which, they might not like them, but they don't contest the method through which the other 12 members were elected. The National Bank of Poland, you know, constitutionally protected. Donald Tusk says he, you know, has strong men that would take them out of the offices, and sort it out. But the Constitution protects the National Bank of Poland. Polish television, this is very interesting. It's difficult for me to see a pathway to actually changing the composition of Polish television without a simple pathway, without a change of legislation. There are various ways that they can think about doing this, and there's talk about cutting off their funding and things like that. So I think it will be difficult for a government to get through legislation, at least until the presidential election is passed. I think the biggest changes we're likely to see are in terms of personnel, and I think in areas that are not constitutionally protected or that don't require legislation to get through.
Yeah,
I would just add, I mean, you know, we're grappling with this issue a lot and trying to kind of figure out how we're going to address that if Tusk does, or whoever from the Civic Platform gets to form the next government. I mean, changing of personnel, other than what you've mentioned, Alex, the legal issues, there is a kind of a debatable or kind of a moral question there, because we're a democratic question. One of the main criticisms of peace is that it has in Poland is that that's exactly what it is, that changed personnel everywhere, at every level of every institution, state institution or agency or ministry. It has brought in loyalists. So if the Civic Platform does that again, it is not easy to do it in a way that doesn't raise exactly the same questions. You know, you could say, okay, our people are more you know, have more expertise, but fundamentally, you know, it's just a changing of elites again. And I think that's going to become quite a focal point of debate if that's what happens. Alex, you wanted to counter that?
Yeah,
I don't want to counter.
I just want to say the way they will justify it is they will say we are replacing party appointees with non-political experts. Basically, that's how they'll do it. I mean, there will be obviously their appointees, but that's the narrative that they will use to try and justify the purge, essentially.
Well, eventually, the point, if indeed there is a change, the point being for most of the electorate is not really are they partisan or they're not partisan, but whether they're an effective team and whether they can govern by delivering the services, the solutions that people are expecting. And if PIS loses, that's also partly because they've been recently more embroiled in different scandals, inefficiency, including the question of gas and lack of gas on several stations. How would you assess, Justyna, now you looked into what the Polish right-wing press writes, but how would you sense the temperature in Polish rooms, in different apartments and houses, Polish homes, when it comes to the things that make people tick? What are the issues in Poland that are important, that make the political agenda actually, certain, that make some initiative in this field?
I went on a trip maybe a week or two ago with Donald Tusk in one of those buses that he takes, the Tuskobus, just to have the opportunity to talk to people around the country. And you know, you end up talking to Platforma supporters, but not only, a lot of opponents also come, and you really get to talk. And I wasn't taking quotes. I really just spent, you know, 12 hours talking to people, and it took my breath away. Because peace makes it very clear that it's about the protection of kind of economic standing of Poles, and it's about physical safety and security related to migration. Those are the key issues that it's focusing. The Civic Platform is focusing on the rule of law, on women's rights, on what happens with the public television and how it's become a mouthpiece for the government. What people say, and that literally happened with every single conversation that I had, was that people are tired of polarization, of anger, of nastiness, of fighting, of combat, and of aggression. And I think that's an incredible, literally everybody said, when I asked about what they think of television, for example, oh, we're just sick of all the fighting and all the nastiness. And because this election has become so personal, again, between Tusk and Kaczynski, they're calling each other names, you know, all kinds of names. It's all about the two of them in a lot of what we hear. I think that the key question for me in this election, in terms of what affects the outcome, is that because it's an election about anger, and people being tired with anger, what that does to turnout. If you talk to sociologists, they would say that both the Civic Platform and Peace are essentially back to their core electorate, to the people, kind of the loyal electorate. And so for either of those, the two main groups, to do well, they need to get people out of the house. So do you get people out of the house? Do you galvanize them with more anger? Do you make them so angry that they just leave the house? Or do you overcompensate and make people stay home? And I think if you look at some of the key voter groups that are in play, particularly women. So we talked to a lot of women. The Civic Platform says very clearly and very openly that it is focusing on women because women are more undecided than men. That a lot of what Peace has done has affected women in the way that the Civic Platform explains it. So they're talking to women and making women come out of the house and vote. A lot of women that I spoke to said, you know what, I just can't listen to all this fighting. I don't want to vote for these people. They're all nasty. So that's an interesting, I wonder which party will overcompensate or will go too far. When it comes to women, the interesting issue is also, I was reading some research this morning, again, that women tend to vote more pragmatically than men, more economic, you know, their orientation is more economic. And the Civic Platform talks about women's rights and the respect and dignity. And whether that's really going to get as far as the kind of redistributive kind of handouts that Peace focuses on. You know, when you talk to kind of women voters, all you hear is childcare, the labor market. Those are key issues for women. They're easier to understand in a way that Peace frames them than Civic Platform. So again, the Civic Platform might overcompensate when it comes to the women voters.
Okay, so we're still in the turf of this voters group and a bit of a prediction. So back to some of the opinion polls data that I can quote from end of August. Ibris for Rzeczpospolita asked people about what are the important issues, and there were 12 altogether. The first was healthcare, the second one was inflation and prices overall, and the third one was the war, security with Russia, and then again there was housing and many of the things that you would say there in any given normal circumstance in a democratic process. How far do you think this fight goes into the turf of these ideological battles? Because it seems also based on what you indicated, Justyna, that the messages of values, the messages, the kind of the big questions seem to be overshadowing what is really important for majority of the electorate in both parties. Or maybe the strategies are different, that you now take pocket size, groups, and you address specific issues in specific areas, targeting voters for where it matters and for whom it matters. How much this plays, how much this helps us understand the political dynamics? What do you think? A question to both of you, but Justyna, let me start first.
I can do something, give a quick answer. That again, the key issues, the economy and the war, the kind of obvious issues that are happening and that are gripping Poland right now, I think are very opaque when it comes to what they mean for the government. Normally, the high inflation, skyrocketing cost of living would be bad news for a government that's been around for 8 years. You could expect voters blaming it for it. PiS has been, I'm sorry, I'm trying to stop my computer beeping. PiS has been very clear in kind of fueling, kind of trying to fan fear that if it loses power, loses government, voters will get less, that the civic platform will take money away from them. The civic platform doesn't actually say that, but PiS is that message on public TV in particular is extremely strong. So you could imagine a situation in which an economy that's beset by skyrocketing cost of living is actually good for the incumbent government here, which again we'll see how that plays out. And with the war, again, my gut feeling and the kind of the conversations I've had with people around the country is that kind of juxtapose over what actually happens in public debate is that PiS is focusing a lot in public media, in public television on fear of migration. You get these, if you watch public news, the evening news, you get a lot of kind of fields full of men, kind of menacingly looking men with a voiceover that says Europe is gripped with fear of migration. But as I said, people are also afraid, are just tired of all that aggression and verbal aggression in the public sphere. So it may leave them, it might make them stay at home, which makes the war then not working in PiS's favor.
The issue of migration that you mentioned in the opinion poll that I just quoted comes as the 12th least important for both electorates and overall for the public opinion.
And PiS is focusing on it. Yes, for PiS, it's a key issue. You see it all, in public debate.
So my question now to Alex: is it more of a defensive strategy of PIS to hold ground in the key constituencies and on key messages, or there's something more into it?
Just before I go on to that, I mean, the two key drivers, I think, of this election are that most people want to change, but most people don't want to go back to the status quo ante. Okay, and the two campaigns, I think, of the main parties are really driven by those two messages. It's time for change, so vote for us, or you don't want to go back to what you had before 2015. And I think the big driver of what happens in the election will probably end up which one of these is more powerful. To come on the thing about migration, so I think, what Justyna said was correct in the sense that, what a lot of this election is about mobilization and demobilization. There's very little crossover from one side to the other. When support goes up and down, it's because voters from one side decide that they're going to turn out to vote, or they decide they're going to abstain. And I think the migration message was aimed primarily at law and justice waverers. So these are people who had voted law and justice, were not going to vote for civic platform, but felt disillusioned for a number of reasons, primarily to do with the economy. And it was to try and create a wedge issue, which persuaded them that if law and justice got in, or the opposition got in, something bad was going to happen. They were going to agree to compulsory migrant relocation, which those people didn't want. In other words, there's going to be a difference between law and justice and civic platform getting in. And civic platform's counterattack has been to try and make those waverers continue to waver. Okay, its message is that actually law and justice is just as bad, on this issue, because look at the number of migrants that they've let in. So all that debate has been about that specific group of people, Law and Justice waverers, people who were going to vote for them but may or may not, and with Law and Justice trying to mobilize them and Civic Platform trying to demobilize them. And the other reason why an issue that seemingly is not that important when you ask it outright has also risen in salience is because it's been linked in with security, which is, I think, a key driver in those questions in this election. So it's not just migration on its own, but migration as part of the security package of issues, which I think is a very big driver of support one way or the other.
Right. We are just about to go into the Q&A session that will be opened by Agnieszka Homańska here with us. Before we do, I have maybe one thing to say still on the record, that primarily what is at stake here in the larger picture, I would first and foremost emphasize the numbers, the public opinion needs, and the key issues that drive the general public. But one fundamental and the issue that we will definitely discuss further in the Q&A is to what extent this is really a civilizational choice, as I do believe that there are two kinds of different versions of future for Poland and Poland and Europe overall, within the two major camps. And one is illustrated by the current member of European Parliament, Mr. Krasnodębski, who spoke on record last year in the radio in an interview when he said that essentially Poland is not as afraid of Russia as of the West, because we have managed to cope psychologically as a nation, culturally, with such an occupational force as Russia, despite all the atrocities committed in the past war times. While the real challenge and the big challenge for Poland, meaning Polish sovereignty and identity, is the West. The West can indeed change us, and this change of Polish society comes as a version of soft power. So it's hideous, it's the subversive and all sorts you can imagine for the currently ruling majority. Hence the skepticism and this disillusionment with whatever the West is how it is represented in the form of supranational structures like the EU, but probably there would be more to enumerate. On the other hand, indeed, you have the civilizational choice of country in which the former president of the European Council and prime minister says that he knows how to run things. Then you have to take it for granted that they actually do. But in essence, the opposition party tries to resonate the message that is very important in the most pro-American society in Poland and one of the most pro-EU societies across Europe. The most pro-American society in the world, according to Pew Research and Transatlantic Trends, and the most pro-European country, that it actually needs to have a government that plugs into the core of both the EU and NATO strategic decision making, whilst for the past 8 years it's been trying to be rather on the sidelines of it rather than the core. But that's an issue to discuss further in Q&A. That will be my beginning question and teasing